I wanted to talk a bit about the whole immigration issue, which is pretty much standard in liberal and libertarian, various sorts of anarchist, whatever that means, theories. Is pretty much no such thing as a restriction on immigration. Of course, within the liberal propertarian framework, you can't immigrate onto somebody else's, property claims. But that's because it's their property claims. It's not the immigration per se that's problematic. It's the fact that you would be interfering with their exercise of control over their property. However, lately a number of libertarians, so-called, and libertarian-associated people, such as Ron Paul, have been speaking in favor of immigration restrictions, and usually on the pretext of the welfare state. And the argument goes something like this. Well, normally, of course, we wouldn't be able to prevent anybody from going anywhere except for onto our own property. But because there is a state, which nobody doubts, that does take people's money and redistributes it around, usually in the form of welfare, but also this happens in the form of subsidies and so forth. And because some of these funds are used to construct, say, highways and other such things, that the people of the country have control over who gets to go around and in the country and receive these welfare subsidies or travel on the public roads and whatnot. And, sometimes they'll say you can think of this as sort of like the people being the joint stock owners of the government. There are a lot of problems with this. It's so weird on so many grounds, and I can only figure that it has any sort of currency in libertarian circles because of the sort of infiltration of the dregs of the Republican Party and other sorts of white nationalist weirdos. It's mistaken to say that because the government takes people's money and gives it to other people, that those other people are engaged in any kind of rights violation. I don't really like to use that term, but we'll just talk about it in terms of violating your property claims, however you arrive at those. They're not. The government has stolen people's money. Okay, that's uncontroversial. And once it has stolen those people's money, it shuffles it around in this myriad of incomprehensible ways. There's absolutely no way to say who that money belonged to in the first place. Okay, so it belongs to the government now, de facto. It is their money. And if you're opposed to the government, then it really doesn't make any sense to say that, well, the government owns this, so we should be able to, control what they do with it. Now, if the government owns it and you don't give a shit about the government, then for all intents and purposes, from your view, nobody owns it. It's just like, forest land out in the middle of nowhere. Which brings me to another point. Most of the land on the borders of the United States is not owned or inhabited by anyone. It's completely empty. It's never been owned by anybody except for sorts of vague claims that the government makes about, having national parks and stuff. But even then, they have no de facto control, and I'm sure there are lots of just open gaps where federal lands don't even cover anyways. There's other problems with this theory too. It's not the case that you have any sort of control over the government, and it's not the case that it's clear who has any right of exercise over the various, capital goods and funds that the government slushes around. So you can't say, the people have a right to prevent, Mexicans or Swedes or whatever from coming into the country, because there's no the people, there's this just reification, and many people within the country have very diverse ideas about who should or should not be let in. Some of them don't care at all. They've paid in various amounts. It's just been tossed all around the world. A lot of it doesn't even remain in the country. And what about those people who weren't, didn't have their money literally taken, but have been somehow otherwise, privileged or obstructed? And under a liberal theory, they would have a right to compensation claims from the government. Well, what becomes of that money? Does it belong to the people it was stolen from? Does it belong to the people who were just directly, interfered with and aggressed against by the government? It's incoherent. And then here's another point. Okay, you don't want, Pedro coming across the border because, he'll take welfare, or he'll be walking on government-built streets or anything like that. But what about international corporations and stuff like that? I mean, what if you don't want Kyocera to be building factories in the United States because they're going to get subsidies that were taken from the taxpayer, and therefore the people have a right to keep out these foreign competitors? I mean, this is the sort of bizarre things that it leads to. And I mean, I think the absolutely most bizarre one is when you get down to it, a lot of these people would recognize that people have a right to ignore the government. Just, unless it's a case of shooting people or something, you can generally just ignore what the government says and tell it to fuck off, and that's all. Well, what sense does it make to say I'm in favor of immigration restrictions, but I'm in favor of people ignoring immigration restrictions? That's just fucking schizophrenic. It doesn't make any sense as a policy. It's internally inconsistent, or at least just pointless, and it certainly doesn't do any good for the coherence and clarity of the liberal message. This is what you have to say. Maybe because of certain policies and forms of government in the United States, that certain people may be disadvantaged when new people come in. That's certainly possible. Not that it's not possible in a non-state system, but it's certainly possible that certain people are going to be disadvantaged, or their wages will drop, or they'll have, damn chinks walking down Main Street. That's definitely going to happen, but it doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point is the proprietarian liberal order that you're talking about in the first place, and the fact that all sorts of screwy and weird results come out when you have the government involved shouldn't surprise you, and it certainly shouldn't cause you to go, running for more interventions. This is the basic problem that Ludwig von Mises pointed out in his middle of the road leads to socialism. Is you have one intervention, and then you want another intervention to fix the problems of the first intervention. Well, that's not going to work. It's not going to work. The border police are just going to be, incompetent, and they're going to be, Nazis, and they're just going to waste money and screw around and keep out all the wrong people. And it's the same with any bureaucracy. The police are ineffective at doing anything. The only thing they do in any way is to push around people in certain really limited circumstances, and even then they're so powerless. I mean, look at all the drugs running around. I don't understand any libertarian who would be in favor of immigration restrictions. It doesn't make sense from a logical standpoint. It doesn't make sense from a liberal standpoint, and it doesn't even make sense in a technical fact. I mean, they're going to suck at it. They're not going to be able to do this. So, I don't know. You're just making up excuses for the government to fuck around.